There is a fight going on with the West that involves everyone, not just Russia and Ukraine, but more so it's the BRICS versus G7 nations. This is what some call the fall of the US dollar. The weaponization of the US dollar is that Russia and China have drawn closer together and have increased the amount of trade between themselves. This trade largely avoids the US dollar as a means of exchange. In fact, the Chinese and Russians have created financial systems of payment that avoid the US dollar. This means that demand for dollars accordingly decreases. The position of Saudi Arabia is key to dollar dominance, as the petrodollar is basic to the dollar's role in global finance. Should the Saudis agree to accept payment for gas and oil in a currency other than US dollars, things will change rapidly in forex markets. The point here is that dollar dominance is not a permanent feature of global finance, and that there are developments that favor an end of the current situation. One can speculate on what would happen should the US currency markedly depreciate. Imports would become much more expensive. It would take some years before production of goods could be brought back to the US. It takes capital and time to build factories and train workers in order to recover market share. Foreign investors would avoid investing in the US due to hyperinflation and rapid depreciation in forex markets. This would result in further monetization of the currency and more inflation. The government might not be able to finance the federal debt and then default on treasury debt. Hopefully, such a catastrophic situation will not come about. Watch this clip interview by Kitco News guest Andy Schectman, president and owner of Miles Franklin.
Joining the BRICS, that you put them all together along with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt Road, you're talking north of 80% of human population. And all it would take, now you have to remember, we're coming from a period of time where asset prices were blown sky high over the last several years, with more money being created in the last 3 than in the history of the country preceding it. A lot of that money found its way into assets, and you have the misallocation and the distortions that are created by this. All it would take would be for Saudi Arabia to stand up on the stage, as they just told the folks at the Davos conference that we're now going to consider taking other currencies for oil. We've already been told that the BRICS currency would be pegged to gold or to commodities, and the assumption being gold being one of the commodities. I think all it would take would be Saudi Arabia to say to the West, thanks for the memories, it's been great, we appreciate it, but we're going to open up oil purchases in other currencies, not just dollars, maybe euros and ruble and rupee and gold. And all of a sudden, bang, all of the countries that have had to hold dollars for the last 50 years no longer really have any interest in holding them. And if they all start to dump dollars, and I think it would happen quickly, where they would all dump dollars, you have a tsunami of inflation hitting the shores of the West that would immediately create a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. This is how we see a great reset, as interest rates spike in relation to a crashing dollar, which then is inversely correlated to asset prices that have gone stratospheric over the last few years, and I would argue irrationally. And as interest rates spike and this inverse correlation hits the shores, stocks, bonds, and real estate, along with the crashing dollar, all collapse at the very same time. And when I ask, do you think it was intended? I guess I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek, but if you think about it, now you have a villain. Instead of blaming the Fed for creating these distortions and letting this happen, you have the Fed there saying they're going to raise rates, but they've done a woeful job at raising them high enough to tackle inflation.
All right, let's put a pause on that one before we get into the Great Reset, which I understand also opens the way for central bank digital currencies and a complete revamp of the system. And let's first focus on how we get to this de-dollarized global economy, or at least an economy where the dollar plays a less significant role. So in this bifurcation of the global monetary system, what relevance does the dollar have?
The dollar will
it's still in play.
Yeah, the dollar will always have a relevance to it, and maybe it's not in its current state. But the thing that I think is really important to understand is that these agreements that are being made with the BRICS represent such a massive part of GDP and of population. At what point does the West decide to or attempt to trade with this group? Are they even going to be welcomed into it? I don't know. It just seems they're being isolated.
Well, because the dollar is so powerful, and because the United States has enjoyed so much privilege having the global reserve currency, why would it just give it up without a fight?
Well, they will. They will fight, and they won't just give it up. But a lot of people will make the analogy to the euro, that all these countries came together and it didn't work. And I think there's something to be said for that. But when you look at all of these countries coming together in a similar rallying cry, for whatever that rallying cry is against the West, it is the backing of the new system by commodities, and perhaps all of it denoted on a distributed ledger. The digital yuan, which has been running for the last 4 years, backing the Belt Road to the tune of over 20 billion in successful transactions, would be, I believe, the rails to a new BRICS currency that would show the immutability of what every country pegged or pledged to the new system, that gives it the glue to make it work, where everyone has the same equal footing, equal say at the table. This, to me, is what would make the system work. As Zoltan Pozsar calls it, a new system backed by commodities, right. Bretton Woods 3, rather than a system backed by debt instruments and promises.
And Andy, we have had other guests on the show, Frank Juster for one, who mentioned this over a year ago, that he sees the trend developing where you will have a central bank digital currency or digital currency on the blockchain, backed, not necessarily pegged, backed by gold and a basket of other commodities. And the transparency that the blockchain allows creates a sense of faith amongst the other countries, going to the expression that there's perhaps distrust amongst them with regards to how they handle their own affairs. So, but again, the idea that the United States is just going to hope that it will be included in this trade system, it just seems a bit far-fetched that there wouldn't be a more aggressive push to maintain that kind of status. Well, what would that look like? What would that look like?
I don't know exactly what that looks like. I'm sure they'll resort to any and all options.
Is it a war? Is it a kinetic war?
It certainly looks like we're heading in that direction right now. With what's happening, we're funding the Ukraine to a total of almost $100 billion. We're selling them Stinger missiles and drones, providing, tanks and intelligence. I mean, you could argue in a court of law, we would be an accomplice to a crime. You could argue we are moving in that direction, and maybe that is what they're going to resort to. But I don't know. And I think the bottom line is simply this. We are indebted to a level that will never pay it back, and interest rates are rising. So at what point do people want to start receiving something that is tangible for the commodities that they're trading or for the business that they're doing with a country that is paying them in inflated dollars? And certainly the treasury market is rife with risk at this point in a rising interest rate market. I think the bloom is off the rose for the West. So what does it entail? How do they fight back? I'm sure they will, and maybe it is war. I don't know, but your point is valid.
Is the conflict then against the Saudis or the Chinese? Because it seems as though you're saying that the Saudis are the kingmakers in all of this if they come out and say no more petrodollar. So who would the U.S. potentially direct its wrath at?
That's a good question. I think the Saudis are joining the BRICS nations so that they have protection from countries that have the ability to back them and stand up to the West. I think, certainly the Saudis would be the linchpin of it all.
Yeah.
But if they're joining a group that has the ability to stand behind them and protect them as part of a unified nation or a unified group, it would seem